another episode of Teens No Cap. I'm your host, Charity Chaffee. I'm a licensed mental health counselor specializing in the treatment of teens and adolescents in the state of Massachusetts. And I have this entire podcast all focused on teens and teens in treatment. And so we're interviewing different experts that are focused on different populations in the teen field. And today I'm joined by two folks that I'm so excited to talk to because it's the one environment I actually have not worked in. And so I have so many questions about juvenile justice. But I will welcome Justyna, Wolek, and Reagan, Webb. If you guys want to take a minute and just introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us, Charity. Yeah, I'm Justyna Wolek. I'm a LCSW here in Portland, Oregon. Currently working at a nonprofit implementing a new youth program for sliding scale, no insurance folks. And then, I worked at Juvenile detention facility for a little while, working in the high mental health trauma units.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. Just like Justyna said, my name is Reagan Webb, and I actually met Justyna while working for McLaren. That's where I completed my practicum. I'm a registered professional counselor for the state of Oregon, and then also a registered applicant for marriage and family therapy. So I completed my practicum for both of those things at McLaren, moved into private practice, and then into a county role working with crisis. And now I am taking a break and looking to move into private practice. So,
yeah. Awesome. Well, welcome. As I was saying, it's funny because I chose, I think, my own version of high-risk teens working in like residential and CBAT, ICBAT. But juvenile justice is the one environment that I haven't really been in, but it's really interesting how a lot of these environments are actually fairly high risk, kind of like high level programs. And so I'm curious, like, what got you into that, like, demographic, into that population?
So for me, when I was looking at completing my practicum, I was really open to experiencing everything that I could. My first practicum site was a more private practice experience, and so I was looking to have experience in a residential or more inpatient setting. And when I was looking into that, I had some family members who have had contact with the youth justice system, and they recommended that I looked at different facilities. And so I reached out to Oregon Youth Authority, which is the overarching government program that runs and oversees youth juvenile justice in the state. And they had some practicum opportunities, and so I just kind of dove into it that way. So had some family members that had experience, but other than that, it was kind of a new world for me.
Yeah, and for me, how did I get into it? Well, growing up, my brother he went to undergrad. His older brother went to undergrad in criminal justice, and I'm a younger sister, so I'm like, I'm going to be like my brother. And so I was always interested in the criminal justice aspect of things, but I always felt like I didn't want to be a part of the problem, and I wanted to be more of a solution. And I was like, how do I work from kind of inside? And I've always wanted to work with kids and teens. And so when I started my master's, it was kind of like a dream goal was to be working at a juvenile facility as we were called QMHPs, Qualified Mental Health Professionals. So it was an opportunity that I couldn't say no to, which is why I had moved out a big reason why I had moved out to Oregon. But it's always just been a passion of mine. I love working with kids and teens, and especially those who are often like misunderstood and misrepresented in so many different ways. Something that I relate to a lot from being a kid. So, it's just a no-brainer kind of.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. I love that. I think our past experiences lead us into different environments that just feel like really fitting. And that was my whole stint with residential too. Like something was calling me for that. And I was like, great, I'll just try this. And I fell in love with it. It was my favorite like level of care. But I imagine you guys both experience this too, where it's because of the kind of high level, high need, it can be really draining. And because you're working within these bigger systems, that in itself can be really exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ray and I were lucky to have a very similar schedule. We worked Wednesday through Saturdays from 9 to 7. I put in bunny quotes because I think we can count on one hand the number of times each of us both walked together out around 7 p.m. Typically, we would be there much later because there's usually crises that are happening or another high need, and working in a, being a clinically sound and strength-based people in a place that's a little bit more punitive and correctional. Um, it, People want to spend some time with you. They are holding on to that. So, yeah, it was it was exhausting. I think we've joked a lot about like one day we're gonna leave here at 7 and it's gonna be great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. And when we were in this role at McLaren, there was a rotating first responder, crisis responder schedule. So because we kind of had opposite schedules, we wouldn't leave the other person just to be the only crisis resource at the facility. So we would almost always walk out together and turn in our keys together. Um, but it was something that was really interesting to me entering that system, was that there wasn't like a designated person overnight to be handling crisis situations, given the acuity rate of how often they were happening. Because there were crises called, I would say, at least one on every single shift.
Yeah. Easily. Yeah.
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 What is a crisis considered in juvenile justice systems?
Yeah, it could be a lot. There was a lot of self harm that I had responded to, like pretty intense self harming, and then a lot of like anytime there was somebody who had mentioned thoughts of wanting to kill themselves was typically responded to with the one of the on-call crisis responders. It could be for a variety of different things. Some people would call for, this kid is really angry, and I'm like, okay, talk to them. Like have a relationship rapport with them. I don't need to have this conversation. Yeah, that was my experience at least with it.
Yeah. So basically, my understanding was anytime there was some sort of violent physical incident or threat to person, that would like be a constituted call, or person to person contact, so a fight. That could be a crisis situation, and also sexual assault would be another thing that we would be the people to write up that report and submit that.
So really quickly for our audience, because I know I can understand like the juvenile justice system, because I did have kids that kind of got placed there, even though I wasn't there. When you were getting new clients on the unit, was that because they were like actually charged? Was it a long-term placement, or was it a short-term kind of assessment space? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know there's differences.
Yeah, so McLaren is the youth state male correctional facility, and because of Measure 1008 in Oregon, youth actually includes youth up until the age of 25. So McLaren actually has individuals ranging, I believe, from age 13 to 25 in a facility. I believe McLaren Youth Correctional Facility had 18 different units. At the time we were there, it could be different now. And each unit had a different population that was sort of designated to that. So that could be violent offenses, that could be developmental trauma, that could be a certain gang designation. And so that would be the population of youth that were on that unit. So basically, youth, when charged, would go to a county level juvenile detention facility. Once they completed their court process, they would then be moved to McLaren, do their treatment, and then be moved to another facility or to the public.
Yeah, it varied for case to case, from kid to kid, based on various levels of so many things, of the conviction, of prior histories, of strengths and risk factors, protective factors. Yeah, essentially, yeah. Like Ray said, McLaren it was a longer term kind of facility where you would do the treatment, and then from there, once you were kind of reached the markings that like probation officers had wanted, and their living like unit managers, we would call them. Then they could transfer. Some would go back into their community if they were able to safely Some would go to proctor homes, which is kind of like a foster home. And then others would go to different, like longer term residential support houses or programs, depending on what really the kid needed.
I can imagine like the clients that I have right now and imagining them kind of like in lockup and in like spaces like that, and I imagine it was probably really hard to be able to like understand the system and where it's at and also like honor their experiences and try to support them. So I don't know if you have like takeaways or if there's things you feel like would be really helpful, because I do feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about youth that are in juvenile justice systems. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Big time. I think that's why Ray and I speak for her, I guess. They're so passionate about it, because we do recognize that. I think, again, for me, um, a lot of the reason why these kids are in the position that they are in was based to the circumstances around them, and their need, our innate need as humans, right, to survive, do whatever we can to survive. And when you're young, your brain isn't fully developed, so you're going to make questionable choices. Some of us have a lot more privilege in not getting caught with making those choices than others, so that's just one factor too. And then like your, what is part of like the generation, what is part of the family culture. um, are you, I've had kids who've often like do resort to and like find community in fellow gang memberships because they didn't feel a sense of connection in their family. um, you're gonna find connection, like that's part of what we do as humans. Yeah, again, I think I'm a big proponent of like not what did you do, but what has happened to you, is often the case of what I see in kids who are in these kind of situations. So
Kind of going off what Justyna just said, and I agree wholeheartedly with what she just said. I think oftentimes what you see in these systems is you see youth being punished for things that have happened to them. So, for example, let's say a youth was in a school district that didn't have ESL or didn't have like proper supports with Spanish speakers, and then so that youth never learned how to read, and then so the system already failed that youth because that shouldn't have been on that youth to learn how. That should have been something that is a societal or government expectation that's given, but we don't. And so then that youth is then punished because they don't have a proper resource. So I think you just kind of see this cycle of kids being punished for things that they didn't necessarily do, and then being in the role of mental health clinician when then you're being asked to give a recommendation for, has this kid taken accountability, when you also recognize and kind of see more of that holistic picture of how much this youth has been failed. I think that it's like a big takeaway of like, how do we kind of remedy or reconcile that with, you have a youth who, may have done something to the public that risked safety, but then how do we also reconcile that this youth had so much done to them, and just kind of in that cycle of trauma, really.
yeah, and it's like really never ending because if you like if you looked at statistics in terms of like just incarceration in general, right? Like America is trash. Like we are a highly incarcerated society, incredibly skewed too based on race and socioeconomic status, which is just another play into the cycle. But like I think I was reading earlier this week that 2/3 of those adults who are currently incarcerated in the U.S. system were incarcerated as minors under the age of 19. So like if you're gonna tell me that that's not a pattern, that like incarceration as a minor is going to lead doesn't lead to incarceration as adult, then I don't like look at the numbers a little bit more. But
I'm sorry. 2/3 of adults that are currently incarcerated were incarcerated before 19.
yeah, I did send you. There's a great website and resource that I use called prisonpolicy.org. They have a ton of information just about the justice system in general, but they put out a lot of data. And I'm happy to, I have it locked and loaded and ready for you to go. But
I'm
yeah,
sorry. I knew it was bad,
Yeah.
Like that statistic makes me like nauseous.
Yeah, yeah. It says more than 2 in 3 people in state prison, 68% are arrested, first arrested before age of 19. Shockingly, more than 1 in 3 people in the state prison, so about 38% are arrested before they turn 16.
Mm-hmm. Uh, I was actually looking for the statistic before we got on this call. Another statistic that shocked me that I don't have the exact number in front of my head is how many youth have parents who are also incarcerated, and I think that's another. Again, don't have it off the top of my head, but another shocking statistic that really goes to show that this is a cycle and a pattern that exists, and it isn't just like one individual's moral failing, or it's not so simple in black and white.
Yeah, and like just going back to what we were saying about like more of like what has happened to you, like if you look at a lot of state juvenile systems will have to publish data reports and findings of like patterns and things that they're seeing in terms of like stats and demographics. And one that I had looked up for that was published by Oregon Youth Authority, I believe in 2024, had noted that like more than like 75% of youth that were incarcerated had some kind of a mental health diagnosis. And then the same primary number for those who have experienced some form of what we would call an adverse childhood experience, right? So, like the trauma playing into that. And mental health too, like just again, it's so cyclical in nature, and it's really frustrating.
It's like really I have often kind of contemplated the idea of like how do we like hold people accountable, teens accountable for the choices they make while at the same time offering treatment, support, and remedies for that because there are so many circumstances that have happened to them, right? They don't choose to be homeless, they don't choose to be hungry, they don't choose to like not have supports at school, right? Like there's all these things that are happening. And I think I struggle with that. It's like, so how do we offer actual treatment that gets to that? But then it goes back to like the political situation of like everyone having housing and everyone having food. And like, I think like that innate survival, like you're right. Like if you're seeing your parent survive in that way, it feels much more like that's the track you follow. And I'm not sure if that is entirely the language, but like it seems like similar.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. Like I tell teens of like you are gonna show the love in the way that you have been shown love, right? Like we are gonna love and care for people in the way that we have been shown love and care. So whether that's gonna be traditionally healthy or maybe traditionally unhealthy, it's the same thing. Like, oh, my parents are doing this, that is my okay to do this too. This is what we do as a family. This is how we take care of things, and we have been surviving this far. That's not on us to blame the kid, and we're not blaming those parents necessarily because they are likely coming from the same situation, right? Like if they're, again, it's so cyclical. Um, and I think you're right. Like it is, I struggled and I think ran into a lot of discussions at with others who are coming from a little bit more of a punitive lens of like, well, they hurt somebody and they should pay for that. And I'm like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't. And we can also highlight and attribute the fact that they've also had a lot of shitty shit happen to them, right? Like, would they have done this if they weren't abused? Would they have done this if they weren't introduced to drugs at a very early age, right? Like that's not necessarily all on that kid.
I think it's really interesting when we think about, all of youth, and Justyna had mentioned that statistic of, brains aren't, there's more research coming out and out, and I feel like the number keeps getting later and later, but brains aren't fully developed until 25, right? And so
Well,
it's,
actually, the research they're saying is maybe closer to 38.
30.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. And, so Justyna and I are in the state of Oregon, and it's really interesting if you think about it. So if brains aren't fully developed until 25, 30, then what does that number 18 mean? So in the past, we thought this number 18 was like, okay, this is when our brains are fully formed. But now we have this research coming out that says, no, it's actually closer to 25, 30, but then our laws don't change and we don't change things on that other end. And so I think it's a really important point. And it was really cool actually to be in a state that did look at that 25, 30 number and say, okay, we're going to change things. Okay, we recognize that youth, in these populations aren't getting the same level of care, aren't getting the same level of education. We recognize that this is a mental health issue, a mental health epidemic that's going on. And so I appreciate that we lived in a state, Oregon, that did make those changes through Measure 1008 and Measure 11, and kind of did those legal jumps that I appreciated. And if you look at statistics in Oregon and longevity and recidivism rates, it's not great, even though Oregon does require all youth that have been adjudicated through a crime to get treatment. Oregon, we keep youth longer. And I think a big reason for that is because we changed our laws, but then we didn't properly fund these programs. And so you have, at McLaren, 5 mental health practitioners for the 500 youth. And it's like, okay, and then all of that burden falls onto those 5 clinicians. And it's like, if you're 5 people helping 500 people, how much impact can you realistically make? I'm not saying you can't make an impact, but how much is slipping through the gaps there? And so I think a lot of this does go back to not just looking at our laws, but looking at our funding and looking at really where is that need and what is the way that we can support the people that are having this face-to-face contact every day without putting the burden on them or the youth, if that makes any sense.
It's so interesting you say that, because I was just thinking, like, in Massachusetts, you have essentially like 3 or 4 different agencies that are supposed to kind of cater to support teens and children, right? So you have your DDS cases, your developmental disabilities, right? You have your Department of like Youth Justice, DYS, right? You have your DCF, which is like the kids that are, like they don't have parents, they're foster kids, like, etc. But what's really interesting, and I have to go look at this number myself, is to consider the amount of funding that each of those have in like how they would rank them, because I'm thinking about the fact that we're talking about how, like, really this is a trauma problem, right? This is like a basic need, like socioeconomic trauma problem. And at the same time, even the kids that are like removed from their home or like are somehow taken into DCF custody, that's not their choice. In the same way that like a lot of the kids that are involved with DYS, like everyone is trying to survive, but I do feel like we fund them differently depending on what situation brings them into care.
Yeah, well, I think, again, just looking at the incarceration system in general and how we treat people who have been through the justice system, right, or who are justice involved, they are typically viewed as second-class citizens, right? They are not given the benefit of the doubt that they can change, or even if they do work hard enough to change and to shift so many things, it's still not good enough to be viewed as somebody who just exists in society, right? And so I do think it continues to add up to that, and that's why you don't see a lot of mental health resources or adequate enough of ones. And I don't know if you know this, Oregon just in general ranks really low out of all the U.S. states in terms of youth mental health prevalence rates. I believe last I checked was like 51 out of 51. So we are. There's just so much work I think that needs to get done, and especially for those kids who are just inherently labeled as bad or problematic or not good enough to be given an opportunity to be successful because of the circumstances that they've been placed in, honestly.
I think really recognizing, going again off of what Justyna just said, like, there are absolutely members of this population who have never had a healthy, consistent adult in their life. Like, maybe there are youth that absolutely the most consistent and stable adult is their parole officer. So I think it's also kind of, as adults in this conversation, reaching out to different disciplines and, bringing this conversation wider to kind of raise that empathy level and as much as we can and advocating in that way as well.
No, it is so interesting because I think that even when I was like supervising interns, when I was working with different folks, it very much felt like nobody really wanted to work with like the juvenile justice kids. And like, I think there definitely was this kind of vibe around like, oh, like I wouldn't want to work with them. But I think what you're saying is like so true. Like when I think about the kids that I have worked with that have often ended up in like a DYS situation, I can't name an adult that had been like really truly a part of their life that was healthy, stable, consistent, and kind of like investing in them in the way that like I think every teen needs that investment.
Yeah, well, I think again, like research has shown the impact of what one stable adult does to a kid or a teen's life, right? Like that's literally all it takes, and for me, that's a big reason why I show up and I do the things. And again, like I feel drawn to kids who are a little bit like tougher to crack, and I make it my mission. I always like said I'd crack them on the head like it's a hard boiled egg or like an egg, and just watch and wait for the egg yolk to come out because I will do it. It's going to take a long time, but I'll do it, and because you deserve it. You deserve somebody who's not going to get scared because you messed up, you fucked up. We all do. Some just are again have the privilege of not getting caught and have other supports, and other people don't.
I was gonna say I think like I love working with the kids that are traditionally like not easy in therapy, right? Like the teens that tell you to go fuck yourself, the teens that are like, I'm not stopping, I don't care, the teens that are like, I'll do what I want, right? Like to me that is such that type of commitment, I guess, to their behavior is so interesting to me, and I just want to know everything. I'm just such a curious person, and I'm just like, tell me all the pieces about this. But I also my base is in harm reduction, and so for me, I'm not here being like, hey, we're going to stop this behavior. I'm just like, help me understand. Like, do you understand all these choices for yourself that you're making? But I love, and I use resistant in quotes because I feel like, one person's resistance is another person's strength. And I think it's a really interesting thing where I'm like, if we could shift that perspective, I think more people would be interested in working with teens. But I think there's a lot of people who are like, if you're not invested, I don't want it. But I'm like, are we really questioning investment if they're showing up and trying to do this stuff, even if they present as like resistant?
Yeah, yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of it, and I think Ray can attest to it too. We got tested a lot in terms of like how we're going to show up for these kids, which rightfully so if you're used to everybody leaving. Like I could think of a handful of kids I've worked with in my career in general, but especially at the youth systems, who have just have not had a stable adult and are working on pushing me away or pushing my buttons and testing me to see what's my breaking point. Yeah.
I'm really curious. Like you had mentioned a few minutes ago around like the whole punitive system, and I'm kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about that because I do feel like if I'm thinking about some of my clients that are maybe a little bit more resistant, or they want to push your buttons, or they're kind of trying to figure you out in the same way you're trying to figure them out, I imagine that they probably have experienced a lot of that punitive nature. But then what is the alternative? Like, is there more of a best practice when we're talking about like these specific populations?
Well, and I think it's honestly something that I think is still even legally highly debated, like in the state of Oregon. Like, the state of Oregon says that my understanding is that youth shouldn't be isolated for punitive reasons, and I'm pretty sure that there are some like ongoing kind of legal decisions being made with that in the state. But no, so basically, like when we were at McLaren, what was happening is, let's say there is a fight on a unit. So a code gets called, security, mental health professional, or the first responder, everybody goes to the unit where that incident occurs. Every single person that was physically involved in that interaction would then be handcuffed and brought to isolation. Basically, that youth can only be brought back to unit when they have one of three adults from their living unit that say it's okay. And that would be the living unit manager, the CC, which is essentially somebody that kind of helps on the living unit with more of the everyday things and involvements in a youth's life, and then also the QMHP, or the mental health professional. So any of those three people could kind of be a part of the team that says, okay, youth, I believe that you're going to be safe and we can come back to unit. And so, I think when you're also the person that's supposed to be the therapist for a youth, having that power imbalance in the relationship is very, very difficult. And, I would say, like, I think mandatory mental health treatment, I think there's a lot of different research on it. I think that it is helpful. Like, let's say, for example, you get a DUI and you're mandated to do treatment. Maybe you go to that treatment and it's not helpful in the moment, but then maybe 10 years from now, you kind of think back to those things and it's helpful then. But I do think, we're mandating this mental health treatment for youth to be able to get out of facility, and how is that too much of an expectation to even put on a youth to a certain extent is what I'm saying. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think I appreciate, like, that's a good point, because there is, like, being in any kind of a system like that very likely is a traumatic experience for those folks, right? For those kids and teens. And so, like, when you're constantly living in something that's resembling trauma, you are often dysregulated, you're often in a state of crisis, and that looks different from everybody, and you're forced to kind of make do with the people on the unit, right? And so it's a great point of, like, how do we then, like, this expectation of completing mental health treatment while people are often living in dysregulation, is that really just, is that really equitable? And, like, what part of the mental health treatment programs need to be adjusted to, like, better navigate, like, how do we do regulation, how do we keep our bodies safe, right? Like, things like that, rather than kind of going in of, like, totally, like, stop, we're done with substances because drugs are bad, as we've learned from those commercials, right? Like, yeah, I think a rewiring or a rethinking of, like, how does the mental health treatments that are being provided really correlate or don't correlate with the living situations that these kids are in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an interesting question, like, in an environment where there are fights happening daily, in an environment where there is high conflict, is that a therapeutic environment? Is that an environment where trauma realistically even can be addressed appropriately? And I think also, for me, a fundamental aspect of all therapy is meeting somebody where they're at. And as a mental health professional in a youth justice environment where I'm told, you can't listen to, like, let's say I'm spending time with the youth and they want to listen to music, but I can't listen to the type of music that they like, which might be rap music or something like that, but I'm only allowed to play a certain type of music. Is that really meeting a youth where they're at? Should a mental health professional, even, like, in a government setting, be limited in that way? Because to me, being told that you can't listen to a certain type of music or being told you can't like a certain type of thing is ultimately, I don't know if you're ever going to make leeway in a youth that might already be a little oppositional. And so I think that's an interesting question as well.
Yeah, and you can learn so much from a kid's taste in music, and it's just like expressive art, right? Like, just for, like, for them to realize, okay, like, you're somebody who's actually interested in what I like, and you're not just going to tell me that it's shit without giving it an opportunity, right? Like, what a big difference that makes. Yeah, which, yeah, again, and a lot of the reasons why they implement these is for safety and to not, continue to enable certain lifestyles and things like that. And that's really hard for us to do as clinicians who, like Reagan said, want to meet the client where they're at and come from a strength-based, person-centered approach.
You make, okay, I have to say this out loud, and I'm probably not going to connect the way I want to, but what's really interesting to me is, like, I've had lots of kids that have been hospitalized, right? And we always think about hospitalization is a short-term 7 to 10 days. It's literally a stabilization period, right? We're just trying to get them to the point where, like, they don't want to kill themselves or they're safe in their bodies, and then we can discharge them and transition them to a lower level of care. And then you have, like, your, like ICBAT, CBATs in Massachusetts, which are like community-based acute treatment. They're not necessarily locked, right? So that's a step down from there. And then you have your, like, partials, your IOPs, whatever. then you have your group homes, like there's all these different levels of care. But what's really interesting, and you make such a valid point in terms of the chronic dysregulation that you experience in those environments, and the fact that when you have a kid who is inpatient, right, the expectation is stability, not treatment. But then in the juvenile justice system, the expectation is treatment surrounded by chronic stress. And it's just such an interesting perspective to think about, like, again, like thinking of them as like second class citizens, like what the expectations are for them in those environments versus like what the expectations are for kids that are brought into care or into treatment in different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's something that like in legislation we have to like really take into consideration. Then in to that point, Charity, like taking into consideration like also where these kids are at developmentally, right? Like we're very aware that trauma and lived experiences impact like how we function cognitively, developmentally, all those things are impacted. And so like the fact that we have this expectation for somebody who might be 19 and presenting like they can do it, but is really actually functioning more at like a 12-year-old level because of the experiences they've had, but we're asking and demanding of them to be as regulated as most 26-year-olds aren't, right? Like, how is that fair, and who then gets in trouble? And there's so many different nuances and layers that get into it, but yeah.
It is like really wild to me to think about the parallels and the expectations we have of folks that are involved in juvenile justice versus folks who are just like brought into treatment in different ways. Like that is like such a good point to me. Like that's what I'm leaving with, to be like, wow, like
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah, and I appreciate you like actually verbalizing that. And that again makes me think, said it a word a couple of times, but like the privilege, right? That like some folks have, and how they get their treatment for very similar presentations, like very different based on where they live, what resources are available to them. Do they have insurance? Like, is it like physically accessible? What's their trauma history like with it, right? Like the privilege to be able to access hospital outpatient or inpatient versus incarceration system, right? Like we'd be remiss not to recognize that there is a big discrepancy in that, and research and data shows all of that too.
I think that's the hard part too, is that I don't know if there's necessarily like a good answer, but I guess it feels like what is happening right now in terms of treatment and like, court systems, like it just isn't enough yet
Yep.
and then like, I mean, I don't necessarily know the data from like other countries, but it is really interesting because I feel like we've had this whole kind of like America's great situation, and like, but then you look at our juvenile justice system and you look at the amount of kids that are like, you know going through that and then essentially getting incarcerated for the rest of their lives sometimes. Like how great is it really if we're not honoring these different experiences?
Right. Great for who? Because it's not great for those folks.
No. Well, then I think going way back to the beginning when we were talking about inclusion, right? And like wanting to feel included by people, like we understand a lot of cult mentality. Like we understand a lot of gang mentality. Like we have that data. And this is one thing that drives me crazy about America in general, is like we have so much data. We have so much data, but like nobody is willing to like rip the band-aid off and actually create systems and force change in the way that it needs to be in order for like those populations to truly benefit.
Yeah, well, because that would mean that somebody would have to do something, right? Like, and people don't want to because it's already benefiting them enough and not hurting them enough where they can sustain it. And that's, I think, also like a really big struggle in it. And I'll be the first to like say like I don't know all the answers and I don't know how to like shift these systems, but I do know in ways in which we perceive the kids who are involved in not just like the justice system, but also like the adoption and foster system, right? Like there's also a correlation between kids who are in adoption and foster and involvement in the justice system, right? There needs to be some kind of a focus in there to better support our vulnerable kids. What that is, I don't know, but it's not what's happening now.
I mean, I'm curious, and I know we have to wrap up in a minute or two, but I'm kind of curious when we're thinking trauma, right? Like I know that we give a lot of trauma reactions mental health umbrella, right? But I think there's so many things to be said that are actually just like traumatic. Like when we're talking about foster and adoption, that is like an initial like nervous system trauma, right? That a lot of people won't recognize as trauma because, oh, you were fine, you were taken care of, right? And not understanding the abandonment piece and the separation and like whatever happens like in a little infant's body or a young child's body when that's happening. Um, but then at the same time, like I think like mandated treatment is really interesting because like does that include trauma treatment? And then the other part, if we're talking about socioeconomic status and like strong like adult supports and healthier relationships, how much of that are things that we are ensuring they're not going to have to fight for survival with once they're out of these systems? And like that's a part to me where I was like, if we're mandating treatment, but then also being like, okay, good luck, you're 18, go take care of yourself, right? Like, are we actively engaging in a system and making sure that they don't fall back into that? And I would say no.
No, again, the number that 2/3 of those in state prisons were arrested before the age of 19, I think, is a clear indicator that has not been helpful. To just say, here, you're going to get support here, but then when you're released, we're expecting you to be fine without the support that you've had here.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of these, going back to that idea of we really aren't meeting this population. We're not meeting kids. We're not meeting youth where they're at. And I think that really does mean having to open up your perspective. And, it's so easy to say, hey, don't be in a gang. But it's a lot harder to actually think about why that youth joined that gang, why like these things happened. Like it's so easy to say don't do that, it's bad for you. Like a lot of these kids already know that, like, hey, this probably isn't great for me, but like it's the best option out of all of the options I've had. And so like I think like to look down at a lot of these issues and be like, oh well, that's good and that's bad. Like, yeah, probably, but is that helpful to like talk about it in that way? Probably not. And so I think like it is going to take some hard conversations. I think it is going to take some really gray thinking in this system to actually be able to service kids how they deserve. And the sad thing is, to me, is that like so many of these youth and so many of these kids are beyond creative, beyond intellectual, beyond brilliant, beyond caring, loving, but they're really put in this box that they can't even see themselves outside of, because of how much stigma is put on them. And so I think, um, yeah, I just think, I don't know if I have the exact answer, but I know what I've seen, and I think that we are going to have to be a lot more creative in how we're approaching youth, because you're right that um I don't think trauma with in general or with this population is just like a one size fits all of like, okay, buy this shoe, do this program and you're fixed. Like, no, I think it's a lifelong relationship of healing, really.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you, and I think it is really it's really challenging because I don't necessarily think there is a perfect answer, and I think that's part of it. I think people want that very regimented, structured, do this, here's the program. When every kid, every situation, every it's so different. But I do think that the data tells a story, and I think it's one of the things where if we can listen to the story and make changes, even those 1% increases, like we could actually just do so much good.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I do agree that the data absolutely does tell a story, and I think it's so ignored, um in a way, because you're right, like the data exists, and why isn't it more addressed? Like, when we do have these statistics, when we do have this data, I think it is frustrating on a you know, human, on a political, on like a psychological stance of being like, okay, we know this is an issue. Why isn't it addressed? Because it really is impacting like people in a very serious way. And I think that matters.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And I think that's like I always say that if we could like find a way to kind of really prevent trauma, we would be so much further ahead. And I think that's like the conversation we're having is how do we prevent this from happening? How do we offer supports in the moment, and how do we then prevent it from happening again? So that they don't get kind of like sucked back into that. Gosh, you guys totally gave me like such a cool perspective, and I'm so grateful that you were on the show today to talk about it, because I think that like this is the conversation we need to be having. Even though none of us really have the perfect answers, but I appreciate like both of your thoughts and your experiences being people who have worked in it. Thank you both again for joining us today. We should wrap up, but Justyna, Ray, I'm so glad that you were able to come on the show today and kind of share your experiences and your insight. And I know I have lots of things I need to even think about from this conversation, so I hope that our listeners are going to take some things back too. So for everyone listening, I'm going to drop contact information below, so that if you want to reach out and talk to Ray or Justine about any of the work that they're doing or have done, I'm sure they would be open to connecting with you and talking more about this. But we will also keep your eyes out for part two, because we'll have them back and we can talk more about juvenile justice and treatment. And maybe we can talk some more about options and just kick some ideas around and see if there's anything that might land in that conversation. Have a good weekend, everybody, because it is Friday, at least here. But I will talk to you guys soon. Bye. Thank you.